Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Morgan, and I am so glad that you are here with me today because we're going to discuss all of the Tudor queens and consorts who contributed to the English Reformation. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I love to talk about women, their agency, their influence, especially when it's wrapped up into religion, because people are so passionate about that. And these queens and consorts were no different. So I'm so honored to be here. Thank you to Natalie for the invitation. And as we move forward, I've structured this chat so that everything we talk about happens in chronological order. It's just the easiest way for me to kind of keep track of all the names and all the queens, and hopefully it's easy for you as well. What that means, though, is that we get to start with a lot of people's favorite, Anne Boleyn. Let's start with the good stuff, right? So when Anne moves from French court to Tudor court, it's remarked upon that she was more a French woman than an English woman. And a lot of times when we hear that quote or we read that quote, what we're thinking about is, oh, well, her wit or her fashion or her mannerisms. And all of that is true. But there's something else about Anne that's going to be fairly unusual at the Tudor court. And that is that when she arrives, she is already a passionate reformer. She has spent most of her life in the service of the French Queen Claude, and her reform views are carryover from her time in France. So before I dive too far into Anne's specific contributions, which I will do, I want to quickly try to define this word reform. It's a tricky word because it's in constant fluctuation at this period. It's a new word around Anne's arrival. And it's hard to use with Anne because she's coming from French court, and as we know, France remains Catholic. But the truth is that there were reform minded women at the court of Francis I and Claude, including Marguerite of Navarre. So, what I say when I mean reform is specifically people who are seeking to eliminate corruption in the Catholic Church. And that's it for now. So at French court, Anne would have absolutely participated in these really cool meetings. I wish we still did them. Do we? They were called salons. And what would happen would be all the women at court who were in sort of the queen's inner circle would get a chance to read different literature or ideas about women and authority and even these religious pamphlets. And these things would circulate, and then the women would sit down and openly discuss them and the ideas that were put forward in whatever they were reading. So Anne and her sister, Mary Boleyn, would have both been exposed to this sort of discourse. And actually, both sisters worked together later on to petition Henry VIII to elevate nuns and monks and other religious leaders to positions of power in this attempt to sort of sort through the bad figureheads, the corrupt figureheads. The fact that most of their suggestions were family members or close friends does sort of bring into question what their motivations were for those. Maybe they were just trying to create some security around their positions of favor. But despite that particular thing being difficult to nail down, there are two things that Anne does really well that contribute to the Reformation. She does these very consistently as well. And the first thing is she believes that the Bible should be written in a language that everyone can read. So at this time, that's referred to as vernacular, but simplified, that's just common English. So she thinks Bibles should be translated from Latin into Common English. And part of the motivation for this is that corrupt church leaders were reading the Bible in Latin, which no one understood. And so they were able to make these laws or make these decisions that weren't necessarily biblically based. So think about things like indulgences, paying for salvation. It's not in the Bible, but the religious leaders of the Catholic Church were preaching as if it was, because no one could fact check them. So, with a translated and printed Bible, um, some people even suggest that Anne and her father were part of some sort of illegal book trade that funneled books from France into England. And Anne, we know, had been in possession of several banned books, and a few others she brought in and put in Henry VIII's Royal Library, where anyone in her inner circle who had permission to go to the library could go find this book and then share it with their friends. So she was really sneaky and clever about how to get information into court and then sort of like disseminated around to everyone. But the most illegal book that Anne had in her possession was called On the Obedience of a Christian Man, and it was written by William Tyndale. And the argument of this book was, wait for it, you probably already know it, that if God creates a king or a queen, there can be no other earthly authority over that king or queen, which means there's no need for a pope. And this is the singular thing that Anne brings to Henry that plunges England headfirst into its version of the Reformation. What's really interesting, though, is even though we see that Anne is using Tyndale's work to benefit herself, she is not personally quite ready to give up all of those Catholic traditions. So, for example, when she's in the Tower of London and she's awaiting her death, she asks for the Holy Sacrament or communion to be brought to her room, because just having it in the room is the same as being in the presence of God. And that is a really, really Catholic perspective. She is also quoted as asking, shall I be in heaven? For I have done many good deeds in my day. And this is interesting because it tells us, again, she's not Protestant. Not even close, because Martin Luther is saying that salvation happens by faith alone. And Anne here is asking if she's going to go to heaven because she did good deeds. So that really does indicate to us that she still has some pretty conservative personal views. So we can label her as a reformer, but not as a Protestant. And the final thing that she really did that pushed forward the progress of the Reformation is that she sort of initiated some legal reform. She became sort of the go-to person when anyone associated with the Reformation was imprisoned. So, for example, if you were in possession of one of those illegal books, if you were a lawlord and you had been translating the Latin Bible into English and someone caught you, if you're sitting in jail for a reform purpose, they knew, petition Queen Anne, because she will advocate for our release and for our freedom. And so Anne really set a precedent there that a couple of Henry's future queens continued to follow as they helped different reformers doing different things, right? So a lot of people consider the next most prominent reform Tudor consort to be Catherine Parr, and I agree. Because while Anne Boleyn can be credited with being an advocate for reform, I really think Catherine Parr is the first of Henry VIII's wives that really falls into what we could call a Protestant. And I'm going to use that with caution even, because even still that word has different and fluctuating definitions. But she's the most outspoken and active queen about this Reformation since Anne Boleyn. She's also the first woman to publish in her own name in England. And she was a fantastic translator. She takes all these old texts and she translates them and then she publishes them to make sure that people can read them. It's really very impressive. In fact, her zeal and her excitement for the Protestant movement was so extreme that she almost gets accused of heresy. Not quite, but almost. So we know she's really passionate. But the fun part of that is Catherine Parr was not a Protestant when she became Henry's wife. She was a Catholic. And we know this because in 1543, when Henry and Catherine were married, 2 months prior to their wedding, Henry passed what was called the Act for the Advancement of the True Religion. And it actually did the opposite of what the title is. It didn't advance the religion at all. In fact, it repealed some of his previous reforms. So he's saying now only royalty and nobility are allowed to read the Bible. Regular people cannot read the Bible. And it criminalized any publisher who published a version of the Bible that wasn't approved by the government. Okay, so he's really like almost walking back his previous reforms right as he marries Catherine Parr. And we know Catherine Parr is a Catholic because she and her previous husband, who had passed away, obviously, prior to her marrying Henry, they had been oppressed. They had actually been persecuted by Thomas Cromwell during the Pilgrimage of Grace. So we know that they were Catholic. And so Henry marries her anyways. And he starts walking back these reforms. Very interesting coincidence. However, the issue with Henry is because he never found consistency in his policies, by this point, the whole country is confused. Nobody knows what's going on, who can have what and why, and can we worship, and what do we do? And it kind of creates an opportunity for Catherine to, once she starts getting more involved with reform efforts, she can kind of subtly publish things with language and with ideas that Henry's okay with at first because he thinks they're aligned. So she does a really great job of that. She is also a really good friend to Henry's eldest daughter, Princess Mary. In fact, it's been suggested that they were educated together. So they're close in age. They grew up together. They have the same education, which is humanist in nature, and then, of course, Catholic. But Catherine, at some point during her reign as queen, starts to really dive into the Protestant way of thinking. So from her time as queen and then into her life after Henry dies, she's in charge of figuring out who's going to teach the youngest Tudor children. At one point, she becomes a ward of Princess Elizabeth and even of Jane Grey. So all of these women are living in the same quarters. They're reading the same things. They're discussing the same topics. And Catherine Parr is acting as a mentor almost to Jane Grey and Queen Elizabeth, or the future Queen Elizabeth. But of course, for Catherine Parr, the way she walks that very delicate line is she frames everything as very humanist. So she would rather have a humanist perspective than have a theological discourse. So she's really going to be influenced more by like a Thomas More or by an Erasmus. And Erasmus is interesting because after the death of Henry VIII, Catherine Parr keeps publishing, and she invites the Princess Mary to do a translation of Erasmus's paraphrases of the Gospel of John, essentially. And the princess agrees. And so she starts doing this translation, and she publishes it under her own name as the princess. But what happens is she figures out that Catherine, she hears a rumor that Catherine is going to use these translations and put them into reform material. So she stops translating. She's like, this is not for me. I'm not going to do anything to do with reform. And she sends the unfinished translation to one of Catherine Parr's advisors, and he finishes it. And then they publish it, again, still under her name, which is interesting because, again, it's going to confuse the people. It's propaganda. Is Queen Mary a Protestant now? Princess Mary. So anyway, the fact that she participated at all is pretty surprising. Although, if we consider the context of royal women who commissioned translations or created translations specifically for lay people, that tradition goes back to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, and even to her great grandmother, Margaret Beaufort. So it would not have been outside the realm of something that made sense for Mary to do when her stepmother asked her to. Like, that would have made sense. What she did, though, was so sneaky. Mary is really sneaky. She changed some of Erasmus's writings in her translation to make the Virgin Mary more authoritative and more present in the story of Jesus. And then she also names Peter as Christ's earthly successor, which of course is the foundation for having a pope. Okay, so Mary, even though she didn't finish the translation, she had already put plenty of her own Catholic spin on what Erasmus had written. So she's very, very clever. Of course, that was published during her half-brother's reign, Edward, and then suppressed during her own reign. So while it's maybe counterintuitive to include Mary I in a discussion about the Reformation, it's important because in some ways her efforts contribute to the progress, and in some ways, obviously, she's trying to reverse the progress of Reformation in England. And what we're seeing it during her reign, Mary I, is that we have officially made that split between Protestant and Catholic, or Reform and Catholic. And you have a whole group of people living according to the Pope's rules. You have a whole group of people who've been living for 20 years according to Martin Luther's salvation alone, scripture alone, grace alone. Okay, so we don't need a pope. So this is the climate that she becomes queen in. But there's a movement that's growing in Europe called the Counter-Reformation. It's still too early to call it that in her reign, but when we look at it in hindsight, we can say, oh, this was at the very start of the counter-reform movement, just like in chess. So the Protestants make a move, and then the Catholics make a move. Move and counter. So that's a counter-reformation. And Mary's all about it. So what's funny about Mary, again, she's sneaky. When Edward was king, he outlawed mass, and she couldn't go to mass. She couldn't hear mass. So what she would do is she would pretend that she was really sick. She'd pretend she was like on her deathbed, and she would petition the king to allow her to hear mass before she died, and he would. And so, her resistance to this movement is really strong. But even her counter-reform attempts, they're just like a little blip in the progress of the Reformation. Because Henry VIII had been walking back reforms nearly 20 years earlier, it's safe to say that England was actually in the process of re-Catholicizing. Universities were doing it. The lay people weren't reading the Bibles. We were kind of reverting to the old ways. So actually, a lot of propagandists from the Protestant sect write Mary's ascension into her role as queen as this dramatic, horrifying event. And it's true, some Protestants fled England, a lot of them associated with Catherine Parr, actually. But a lot of historians really do think that Mary's ascension into her role as queen was not that dramatic. Catholicism's on the rise again, okay? And she has taken her crown, right? She's had Jane Grey executed. So for the existing Catholics, this feels like a triumph. It's triumphant. It's happy. It's people rejoicing in the streets when she becomes Queen Mary. So she enters the throne, and she has an agenda. So her reign, she gets this terrible nickname. We've all talked about it. Her reign is nowhere near as bloody as her father's, right? But she gets labeled as Bloody Mary. And it's because she did have somewhere between 280 and 300 Protestants burned at the stake for heresy. And that's a pretty gruesome death. Although, again, in context, probably not as dramatic for the people of the time as it would be for us now. So you have to kind of look at everything through that lens of context. But she earns this name. People don't like her. So her primary contributions to the re-Catholicism of England are she's going to marry a Catholic prince, or rather Philip II of Spain. She's going to reintroduce Mass in 1557. And then she's going to bring back the importance of the Holy Sacrament, the importance of communion, something that had been gone under the Edwardian time of Reformation, kind of. But she does keep some of her brother and some of her father's Reformation contributions to the religious landscape. So she's going to continue to encourage the clergy to be more educated. She is going to say it's okay if you want to learn and recite your catechisms. And she's actually going to be willing to de-emphasize the idea of praying to the saints or like the icons. So that's a pretty big, it's not really a compromise, but it's not as dramatic a change. It's not as dramatic a counter-reformation as what you might assume. So then comes Elizabeth I, and she's been watching since she was literally born the nation be torn apart by these discussions about religion. So when she comes to the throne, her decision is to create as much harmony as possible. But she's a true Protestant humanist. She is the first true, I would call her a Protestant queen. And she does kind of allow people to worship how they want, but again, to a point. She's still dictating what can be taught in the different arenas. So for example, Elizabeth's going to say, if you're preaching, you're only preaching about the Gospels, the epistles, or the 10 Commandments. Like those are the big three. That's what she wants people to learn about. And it's the only way that she can be sure that the Catholics aren't going into church and like preaching against her and influencing her subjects. And she's also kind of a reflection of her very beloved stepmother, Catherine Parr, because she's going to remain focused on education of the clergy and accessibility of these religious materials. In fact, Elizabeth takes a page out of the medieval author Christine de Pizan. She takes a page from her book, and her choice, Queen Elizabeth's choice as queen, is to position herself as almost like a guiding parent in the religious sense. Because Christine de Pizan says if you're a tyrant, you're a bad parent. And so Elizabeth really takes this on. She takes it to heart. She doesn't want to be perceived like her father or even her half-sister, right? So then it's funny because when Elizabeth becomes queen, Rome doesn't know what to do with her, because England has had this resurgence of Catholicism. So the Pope is feeling hopeful, but he doesn't know yet what Elizabeth's going to do. So he's hesitant to excommunicate her right away because maybe she won't be that bad. And she's single. Maybe she'll marry a Catholic prince and convert that way. Or if she is Protestant, maybe she'll let people be Catholic based on some of her sister's policies. So the Pope, Paul IV, his action is no action. And then on Elizabeth's side of the camp, she's expecting that as soon as she becomes queen, the Pope is going to say that she's illegitimate, and he's going to say Mary, Queen of Scots, is the rightful queen of England. He doesn't do that either. So Elizabeth and Pope Paul they equally confuse each other. But Elizabeth sees the opportunity. And so what she does is she tells the Pope that she's sending a delegation to him to discuss the future of England and religion and all of those things that the Pope really would be invested in. And she keeps saying that. They're on the way. They're coming. They're on the way. I've sent them. And he's waiting, waiting, waiting. And of course, no one shows up. She does this, right? With even like her romantic suitors. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And then it never does. I love Elizabeth. So in the span of time when the Pope is waiting for her delegation that she hasn't sent, she and her parliament pass two pieces of very important reform that will solidify the official start of a Protestant existence in the country. And the first is called the Act of Supremacy, where she definitively splits England from Rome. Big deal. And the second is called the Act of Uniformity. She's going to try and centralize religion, essentially, and make everyone do the same thing so that it's easy to regulate. And so that there's no questions, right? Everyone up until this point is like, what's going on? What do we believe? And Elizabeth says, oh, here's what you believe. So she rejects this title, head of the Church of England, which was her father's title. And she takes a slightly less domineering title, which is Supreme Governor. Sounds really nice. And then in addition, this act of uniformity is going to create a cohesive church experience. So every person in every church is teaching from the same prayer book, okay? They're teaching the same things. They're wearing the same outfits. And then everyone in the nation is required, I don't want to say nation. I don't think nationhood is the right word yet. Everyone in the country is required to go to church. It's like mandatory attendance, okay? So finally, a Protestant church exists as a formal, though government-approved, cohesive body. Elizabeth was excommunicated later by different popes, so she doesn't totally avoid that. But the inaction of Paul IV gave her just enough time to do the things that she needed to accomplish her reforms, establish her authority, and prove that she was a competent leader. And all of that was crucial to her reign because she faces attacks on her land and on her crown in the decades that follow. So I would say it's really safe to say that the Tudor queens and consorts all contributed to what we would call the long Reformation. But it was Elizabeth's reign where we truly see that Protestant Reformation movement thriving and unifying. We can't truly call any of Henry VIII's wives Protestants. We just can't do it. Maybe Catherine Parr, but maybe not even in her time as a consort. So maybe later in life. She's certainly the closest of Henry's wives to that label. But of course, Elizabeth I, the first Tudor queen to bring the Protestant vision to fruition, define it and enforce it. So I just want to say thank you again for joining me today. And please know I'm just giving you an overview here. But if you have more questions, reach out to me on social media or reach out to Natalie, and I can direct you to sources or books or any information if I can. Enjoy the rest of the talks, and hopefully I will see you again soon.